What's coming is worse than a recession, and almost no one is prepared. We are living through the silent collapse of the greatest economic power of the 20th century, failed wars, broken alliances, and an economy suffocated by debt. But the most terrifying part? Collective denial. In this video, you'll understand what's really happening and why it directly impacts your future, your finances, and your freedom. For decades, the United States stood at the center of global power. It set the rules, won wars, and dictated trends. The narrative was clear: nothing could shake the American empire. But today's reality tells a different, and far more unsettling, story. The U.S. lost the Vietnam War. Then came defeat in Afghanistan. It failed in Iraq. And now it's bogged down in the Ukraine conflict, as its global influence rapidly erodes. Military invincibility has become a myth, and that has deep consequences. Domestically, things aren't any better. Public debt has skyrocketed. Families are buried in loans. The cost of living keeps rising while wages stagnate. And the solutions offered by Democrats and Republicans seem more focused on saving face than solving real problems. Political polarization, institutional distrust, and the lack of real alternatives have created an anxious, frustrated, and often apathetic society. The truth is harsh, but it must be told. We are witnessing, in real time, the weakening of the greatest empire of the 20th century. And most people haven't even noticed. In this video, we'll break down the main pillars of this silent collapse: the decline of American hegemony, the rise of the BRICS and China's growing dominance, the burden of debt and the real impact of inflation, the collapse of the political system and rising inequality, and the decisive role that ordinary people can play in this turning point. You'll understand how we got here and why this changes everything. If this type of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Here, truth comes before narrative: the decline of an empire. For much of the 20th century, the United States represented the peak of global supremacy, victorious in world wars, leaders of the space race, and stewards of the almighty dollar. It was almost impossible to imagine a world without American influence, but the empire began to crumble. And like every declining empire, the signs appeared long before most people noticed. The first symptom was military. The nation that once only won began racking up defeats. Vietnam marked the beginning of the fall, a humiliating withdrawal that history books still try to soften. Then came Afghanistan, where the U.S. spent billions over 2 decades, only to watch the Taliban retake control. The same story repeated in Iraq. And now, in Ukraine, despite massive support for Kyiv, the conflict drags on with no victory in sight. These defeats are not merely military, they are symbolic collapses of power. They reveal that the U.S.'s ability to assert control has weakened, and that has direct consequences on global politics. At the same time, American diplomatic influence has also been shrinking. In the past, a single gesture from Washington could realign entire nations. Today, many countries prefer to deal with China, Russia, or act independently. U.S. authority is no longer enough. But perhaps the most alarming aspect is internal. Politics has become dysfunctional. Democrats and Republicans clash over culture wars, while the real nation sinks into debt, inequality, and disillusionment. Institutions are discredited, the population is exhausted, and the leaders seem more concerned with preserving their image than acknowledging what's really going on. This collective denial is the most dangerous trait of decline. It prevents preparation for a transforming world. Worse, it feeds the illusion that the empire remains untouchable, when, in reality, it's already in free fall. As the U.S. pretends everything is under control, other forces are quietly stepping into the void it's leaving behind. The BRICS and the rise of a new global power. As the United States faces its decline, a new and silent force is rising on the international stage, the BRICS bloc. What began as an alliance between 5 emerging nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is now becoming the backbone of a new global order. And leading this transformation is China. With a highly strategic economic model, massive investments in infrastructure, technology, and diplomacy, China has positioned itself as a real alternative to Western influence. It's not just competing with the US. In many areas, it has already surpassed it. Today, the BRICS represent more than 60% of the world's population. In terms of economic output, they have already overtaken the G7 nations, which include the United States, Japan, Germany, and other former centers of power. When it comes to trade, international financing, or infrastructure projects in developing nations, the center of influence has already shifted eastward. A symbolic example: today, most of the railway tracks being built in Africa are financed and constructed by Chinese companies. Instead of turning to Washington or the IMF, many nations now prefer to negotiate directly with Beijing, where the rates are better, the requirements are lower, and the results come faster. And that preference is no accident. It reflects the erosion of trust in Western powers and the rise of an alternative leadership, one that now speaks for more than half the planet. Indonesia illustrates this shift well. With nearly 280 million people, the country chose to formally join the BRICS, ignoring diplomatic pressure and signaling that the future lies with the new alliance, not the old guard led by the US. Meanwhile, American decision-makers insist on maintaining a narrative of superiority, as if nothing has changed. But the world has changed. And now, global decisions are made in Beijing, not Washington. The rise of the BRICS is not a threat, it's a reality. And this new reality is already starting to impact the very heart of the American economy, as we'll see in the next chapter. Protectionism is sinking the economy. In response to its loss of global competitiveness, the United States has turned to an old tactic: protectionism. Import tariffs, trade barriers, diplomatic retaliation, all in the name of defending domestic industry. But in practice, this has led to the opposite: the suffocation of innovation and technological progress. The most symbolic case is the automotive sector. While Tesla is sold as the pinnacle of innovation in the US, the real revolution is happening across the world. Chinese company BYD has already surpassed Tesla in electric vehicle production, quality, and cost. Yet almost no one in the West has heard of it. Why? Because Chinese electric cars face a 100% tariff to enter the US market. That means if a BYD truck costs $30,000, an American company would have to pay $60,000 to import it, $30,000 to the manufacturer, and another $30,000 in taxes to the government. The goal of this tariff is clear: to protect US automakers like Ford and General Motors from competition. But the real consequence is that thousands of small businesses, transport companies, retailers, and farmers lose access to cheaper and more efficient technology. And in the end, the cost is paid by the consumer. This kind of measure may seem patriotic, but it's really an economic break disguised as nationalism. It keeps the country from keeping pace with global innovation, raises production costs, and weakens the US's ability to compete with companies from other nations that have already adopted these technologies with Chinese support. And it's not just with cars. This is happening with software, industrial equipment, semiconductors, renewable energy. China is exporting the future. The US is importing fear. Protecting the economy is necessary. But you don't do that by hiding from the world. If the US keeps trying to block competition instead of evolving, it will only accelerate its decline, while other economies move forward. And speaking of decline, there's an even more silent, yet far more destructive force eating away at the American empire. Debt. That's what we'll examine in the next chapter. The debt that devours everything. If there's a poison that corrodes empires from within, it's debt. And today, the United States is neck-deep in ever-growing debt, both at the individual and national levels. Starting with households, the average American lives in debt. Maxed-out credit cards, student loans that stretch over decades, crushing mortgages. Easy credit became a trap. The consumer culture pushed for decades is now coming back with interest. Literally. In the business world, the situation is also critical. Thousands of companies operate in the red, surviving only through continuous borrowing. These are called zombie companies, businesses that can't generate enough profit to even pay the interest on their debt. They don't live. They crawl forward, indebted, awaiting their final collapse. But the most alarming picture is that of the U.S. government itself. Public debt has surpassed $30 trillion. The annual interest alone on this debt already consumes a massive portion of the federal budget. And here lies a geopolitical paradox few people notice. America's largest creditors are countries like Japan and China. Yes, China, the U.S.'s top strategic rival, is also one of the main financiers of the American government. The U.S. Treasury owes over $850 billion to the Chinese. That means every time you pay a tax in the United States, whether at the gas pump, on cigarettes, or from your paycheck, a portion of that money ends up in Beijing. And that money doesn't just fund Chinese universities or infrastructure. It also helps support the military buildup of a country the U.S. claims to want to contain. It's the empire paying interest to its own shadow. The dependency is so great that if China decided to sever those financial ties, the impact on the U.S. economy would be catastrophic. But the reverse is also true. China knows it holds a powerful tool of influence. Meanwhile, the media pretends everything is fine, and politicians keep promising growth, even as the hole keeps getting deeper. But this illusion goes beyond debt. It also hides in the prices of the products you consume every day. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. The inflation deception. The inflation and interest rate deception. Inflation is treated like a natural phenomenon, almost like the weather. It just happens. No one can predict it. We have to adapt. But this is one of the biggest lies in modern economics. The truth? Inflation is a decision. Not an individual one, of course, but a decision made by the large corporations that hold pricing power. In a capitalist system, it's not consumers who control prices, it's employers. And when costs rise, the weakest link always ends up paying the price. The working population. In recent years, wages have barely increased, if at all. But prices? They've skyrocketed. Fuel, food, rent, transportation. Your money buys less, yet the narrative you're fed blames external crises, bird flu, international conflicts, everything except the true culprits. And when the government decides to fight inflation, the solution is always the same: raise interest rates. But let's be clear, high interest rates don't hurt billionaires. They keep traveling, investing, and profiting. The ones who feel the impact are ordinary people who see their credit card bills go up, their car loans become heavier, and the dream of home ownership slip away. This remedy is bitter, but not for everyone. In fact, it's sweet for the banks, which profit even more from the growing debt of the population. And there are alternatives. In the 1970s, President Nixon imposed a price freeze. And it worked. Inflation stopped the very next day. During World War II, the U.S. government regulated prices and wages to prevent abuse and protect the people. So why isn't that even considered today? Simple. Because it would affect the profits of those who really call the shots. The rise in interest rates, sold as necessary, is a political and ideological choice, one that transfers income from those with less to those who already have too much. But all of this is part of something even bigger: the way the market, in times of scarcity, rewards only the wealthy and excludes everyone else. And that's the cruel and invisible logic we'll discuss next. A market that benefits the rich. We're sold the idea that the market is fair, efficient, and impartial. But in practice, it works like a cruel filter. In times of scarcity, only those with money make it through. Imagine a simple scenario. There's a milk shortage. Production has dropped. Supply is low. Who gets to buy it? Those who can pay more. It doesn't matter if you have small children at home. If you can't compete with a higher offer, you walk away empty-handed. The market doesn't measure need. It measures purchasing power. This logic repeats itself across the board: housing, healthcare, education, food. In any crisis, the system favors those already at the top, while the majority are left on the sideline, waiting for leftovers. That's how capitalism deals with scarcity. It doesn't seek collective solutions like rationing or fair distribution. It simply lets money decide who lives with dignity and who doesn't. During the pandemic, for example, while millions lost their jobs, the world's richest saw their fortunes grow dramatically. Why? Because crises don't affect everyone the same way. They expose, amplify, and accelerate existing inequalities. And what's most alarming is that we've been trained to accept this as normal, as if it's natural for the market to operate like an auction, where well-being becomes a privilege for those who can pay more. But that normality is manufactured, and it begins to collapse when people realize they've been left behind. And it's in this moment of widespread disillusionment that populist figures begin to rise, leaders who promise to break the system, but who often end up deepening the divide. That's exactly what we'll explore next: Democrats, Republicans, and the leadership void. With inequality worsening, debt rising, and quality of life collapsing, you'd expect political parties to act in defense of the population. But what we've seen in recent years is the opposite: a political elite disconnected from reality, more concerned with appearances than with the suffering of ordinary people. Democrats and Republicans have become two versions of the same thing. They promise change, but deliver stagnation. They argue over narratives, but agree on maintaining a system that concentrates wealth and spreads poverty. In this vacuum of representation, populist figures have gained momentum. Donald Trump is the most obvious case. He sensed something others ignored. The people are exhausted and are looking for any sign of a break from the status quo. Trump used that frustration as fuel. He attacked the elites, defied conventions, and said out loud what many were thinking in silence. And despite contradictions and scandals, he won over millions of voters who felt seen for the first time in decades. On the other side, Bernie Sanders also embodied that spirit of disruption, but with a progressive, socially just agenda. The difference? The Democratic Party blocked his rise. That blockade is symbolic. It shows that the political system, across the board, is terrified of real structural change. It prefers predictable chaos to uncertain transformation. The result is a nation adrift, governed by parties that don't govern, represented by leaders who don't represent, and a people growing increasingly frustrated, disillusioned, and vulnerable to shallow solutions for deep problems. Meanwhile, the real culprits behind the crisis remain protected. And those who pay the price of collapse are always the same: those at the bottom. In the next chapter, we'll understand how that burden has been placed directly on the working class, and what the consequences are for America's social future. The cost of growing inequality. While political speeches talk about growth, recovery, and optimism, the reality on the streets tells a different story. Social inequality in the United States has never been deeper than it is now. The top of the pyramid keeps accumulating wealth at historic levels, while the base is crushed by debt, inflation, and job insecurity. The economic elite, instead of shouldering the costs of decline, shifts them onto those with the least power to resist. And this doesn't happen by accident. It's how the system is designed to work. When an empire begins to decline, the upper classes do everything they can to preserve their privileges. They cut rights, defund public services, and increase the burden on workers, always under the banner of fiscal responsibility. But the result is what we see today: a generation working more, earning less, and living in constant fear. Young people unable to leave their parents' homes. Families forced to choose between paying rent or buying food. Meanwhile, corporate profits are breaking records. This inequality isn't just unfair, it's unsustainable. Because a society in which the majority sees no future is a society on the brink of social collapse. But not all is lost. In recent years, signs of resistance have emerged in unexpected places, and that's exactly what we'll explore next. The rebirth of the labor movement in the United States. The return of the labor struggle. For decades, the American labor movement was weakened, attacked, and marginalized. Unions were portrayed as corrupt, useless, or outdated. Laws made organizing difficult, and the dominant narrative convinced millions of workers that fighting together no longer made sense. But that's starting to change. In recent years, a new wave of labor consciousness has begun to rise. It's not coming from traditional union federations, but from unexpected places: Amazon warehouses, Starbucks cafes, logistics centers, and tech companies. Young, precarious workers, many with no previous union experience, are saying enough. They're organizing strikes, voting for union representation, and confronting corporate giants with courage and strategy. Cases like Chris Smalls, a former Amazon worker who led the formation of the company's first union in Staten Island, show that a spark has been lit. And that spark is spreading. What these workers have realized is simple but powerful. Alone, they are disposable. But together, they are essential. And the system, which for so long depended on the passivity of the working class, is starting to tremble before this grassroots reorganization. This doesn't mean the battle is won. Corporations still have endless resources to suppress movements, buy political influence, and spread fear. But it does mean that something is changing. The return of the labor struggle is not just an economic issue. It's an act of democratic reconstruction, where those who have always carried the system on their backs begin to demand more than crumbs. And this reorganization may be the beginning of something even bigger. The moment when the people truly take the lead. And it's about that role, your role, that we'll speak next. The power of popular mobilization. The fall of an empire always leaves one question hanging in the air: who will take control of the future? In the United States, there's a vacuum of real leadership. The political elite is discredited, institutions are weakened, and corporate interests continue to dictate the rules. But there is a force that can change the game. And it's not at the top, it's at the bottom. Workers, women, youth, immigrants, Black communities, formerly incarcerated people, groups historically pushed to the margins, are starting to realize that change won't come from above. And that's why, in many places, they're organizing, forming coalitions, and demanding not just rights, but a new way of living in society. These movements are still scattered and fragmented, but they share something in common. They reject complacency. They reject the idea that the only option is to accept the world as it is. And that terrifies the powerful. It's no coincidence there's so much investment in surveillance, misinformation, and repression. History shows that no empire falls without a fight, and no transformation happens without popular organization. The great challenge is turning that dissatisfaction into coordinated action. It means setting aside superficial divisions to build bridges between causes that, at their root, stem from the same problem: the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few. When different groups unite around a common vision, justice, dignity, equality, the impact is real. That's how it happened in other critical moments in history, and it can happen again. But for that, we must remember, the system only stays as it is because it assumes you won't fight back. The good news? You can. And to understand how this resistance can truly gain momentum, we need to look at one powerful example from the past: the New Deal. The forgotten example of the New Deal. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the United States faced an economic collapse comparable, in depth and impact, to what is unfolding today. But unlike today's paralysis, there was a bold and transformative response. President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a set of public policies that redistributed wealth, created jobs, and laid the foundation for the American welfare state. The government created Social Security, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and, most importantly, directly employed over 15 million people. It was the state recognizing that the market alone would not solve the crisis, and acting accordingly. And all of this was only possible because there was organized popular pressure. Unions, social movements, rural and urban workers pushed the system to respond. Today, that legacy has been diluted, distorted, or forgotten. But it proves something fundamental. When the people push, and the government listens, structural change is possible. The problem is that today, the system prefers to simulate action. It pretends everything is under control, while inequality explodes and the economy sinks into bubbles and debt. And often, to cover up that failure, it resorts to an old trick: war as an economic solution. But the question is, does that tactic still work? The illusion of war as salvation. Historically, the United States has used war as an economic tool. During World War II, the country emerged from the Great Depression by converting civilian factories into military complexes, employing millions of people. War, though tragic, became an economic solution. Since then, many politicians have clung to the illusion that armed conflicts can still have the same effect. But the world has changed, and that logic no longer holds. Today, wars are extremely costly, unpredictable, and politically unstable. Recent conflicts, like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, drained trillions of dollars, caused humanitarian devastation, but brought neither sustainable growth nor economic stability. Worse, excessive militarization diverts resources that could be invested in infrastructure, healthcare, education, and jobs. The arms industry profits, but the population pays the price through taxes, inflation, and the deterioration of public services. Behind the scenes, war also serves to stoke fear, justify cuts to civil rights, and strengthen state control. But economically, it solves nothing. It merely postpones collapse. Still, war rhetoric remains alive. It's used as distraction, as social anesthesia, as a tool for political survival. And when wars fail, as is happening more and more often, another kind of attack emerges: economic warfare. Which brings us to the next point: the sanctions imposed on Russia, and how that strategy, once again, backfired. Sanctions that empowered the enemy. With the war in Ukraine, the United States turned to its favorite geopolitical weapon: economic sanctions. The promise was clear: to strangle the Russian economy, devalue the ruble, and force a quiet surrender. But the opposite happened. Russia responded swiftly, redirecting its oil and gas exports to partners like China and India. Countries that, unlike Europe, don't blindly follow Washington's interests. The result? The Russian economy didn't collapse. The ruble didn't become rubble. In fact, Russia has grown faster than the US over the past 2 years. It backfired. The sanctions didn't weaken Moscow. They strengthened BRICS alliances and exposed the fragility of Western influence. Meanwhile, European countries faced energy crises and inflation, and the US lost credibility as a global economic leader. These strategic failures highlight a bigger issue: America's inability to understand the new multipolar reality. And this disconnect between rhetoric and reality isn't an exception, it's the rule. Which leads us to the next chapter: an empire that no longer sees the world as it is. A country that no longer sees the world. Perhaps the most dangerous trait of a declining American empire isn't its military or economic weakness, but its strategic blindness. While the world reshapes itself, American leaders continue to operate with a Cold War mindset. They talk about global leadership, Western values, international security, as if they were still the sole reference point. But the reality has changed. Most emerging countries are seeking new alliances, new currencies, new trade routes. China and India are expanding their influence. Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia are drifting away from the Washington-Brussels axis. And even in the face of these signals, the US keeps making decisions based on a world that no longer exists. They bet on sanctions that don't work, wars they can't win, and speeches that fail to convince. This disconnect is evident even in headlines. While the American media celebrates a 2.7% economic growth as global leadership, China grows at 5%, and India at 7%, quietly and efficiently. But this denial isn't only external, it also shapes US relations with its strategic allies. One of the clearest examples of this is the United States' unconditional support for Israel, and the geopolitical cost of that choice. The geopolitical cost of supporting Israel. For decades, the United States has maintained an unwavering alliance with Israel. But what once seemed strategic now carries a high diplomatic price. With the worsening conflict in Gaza and increasing accusations of civilian abuses against Palestinians, the U.S. has become a complicit actor in the eyes of the world. At every UN vote, this image is reinforced. Over 150 countries side with the Palestinians, while the U.S. stands isolated alongside Israel. This unconditional support protects no one's security. It merely alienates allies, fuels resentment, and undermines America's legitimacy as an international mediator. That cost, which grows by the day, is largely ignored domestically, but painfully visible abroad. And that brings us to another neighbor at risk: Mexico. The looming crisis in Mexico. While focusing on distant conflicts, the United States seems to be ignoring the ticking time bomb right next door. Mexico. With aggressive immigration policies and increasingly heavy trade tariffs, the U.S. government is threatening to destabilize its largest border partner. Millions of Mexican immigrants live in the U.S. and regularly send money to their families, a vital pillar of Mexico's economy. If they are deported en masse, as some political proposals suggest, this flow of income vanishes. At the same time, if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Mexican goods, local industries could collapse. The result? Unemployment, social unrest, rising violence, and a border on fire. To ignore this is more than a strategic mistake. It's an invitation to regional chaos. And now, with this entire scenario laid out, we must answer the central question: what happens next? The American empire isn't collapsing overnight. It's unraveling in slow motion before a society that refuses to see it. Wars are no longer won. Debts are never paid. Influence is fading, and political promises turn to dust. But what comes after is still unwritten. It will depend on two things: what the world does and what we, the people, choose to do. History is not written only by presidents and generals. It is also shaped by workers, students, social movement, by ordinary people who decide not to accept collapse as fate. We are at a turning point. The question is, will we stand by and watch? Or will we take part in the rebuilding? If you've made it this far, it's because you see that something is deeply wrong and must change. This video is not just an analysis, it's a warning, but it's also an invitation. If you believe the truth needs to be told, share this content. Send it to friends, groups, social media. The more people understand what's at stake, the greater the power for change. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave your comment below. Which part of this video impacted you the most? Do you believe there's still time to reverse this collapse? Here on Mr. Monny, we don't sell illusion. We reveal what lies behind the curtain. Because change only begins when the truth is no longer ignored.